Marcus Thompson stood in the early morning rain outside the Royal Military Academy, water dripping from his worn jacket onto the cobblestone path. At 22, he was older than most recruits, his calloused hands telling stories of years spent working in his father's blacksmith shop. The grand iron gates before him seemed to mock his presence, adorned with golden eagles and inscriptions in Latin that he couldn't read. His mother had sewn patches on his only decent shirt the night before, her fingers trembling as she worked by candlelight. "You'll make us proud, Marcus," she had whispered, though her eyes betrayed her doubts. The Thompson family had never produced a soldier, let alone a member of the prestigious Royal Guard. They were simple folk from the village of Millbrook, where the biggest excitement was Market Day and the Harvest Festival. The other candidates around him looked different. Their boots shone with fresh polish, their uniforms were perfectly tailored, and they spoke with the refined accents of the capital city. Marcus recognized the names they dropped in conversation: prestigious military academies, famous generals, forefathers' family legacies stretching back generations. He pulled his shoulders back and tried to look confident, but inside, doubt gnawed at him like hunger. The recruitment officer, Captain Reynolds, emerged from the academy building with a clipboard and a stern expression. His uniform was immaculate, every medal polished to perfection. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice cutting through the morning air, "you are here because you believe you have what it takes to serve His Majesty as a Royal Guard. Let me be clear, only 1 in 50 candidates will earn this honor." Marcus felt his stomach drop. 1 in 50. He looked around at the sea of confident faces and wondered what madness had brought him here. It had started 3 months ago when recruiters visited Millbrook. They spoke of honor, duty, and the chance to serve something greater than oneself. But more than that, they spoke of steady pay, food, and shelter, things his family desperately needed after the drought had destroyed their crops. The first test was academic. Marcus stared at the examination paper, recognizing perhaps half the words. Mathematics had never been his strong suit, and the questions about military history might as well have been written in a foreign language. Around him, pens scratched confidently across paper while he struggled to remember basic arithmetic. When time was called, he had managed to answer maybe a third of the questions, and even those felt wrong. The physical tests came next. Here, Marcus thought, surely his years of heavy labor would serve him well. He could swing a hammer for 12 hours straight and lift anvils that made other men grunt. But the Royal Guard tests were different. They required precision, finesse, and techniques he had never learned. The fencing instructor, a wiry man with silver hair, demonstrated proper sword positions that looked nothing like the wild swings Marcus was used to. "Thompson," the instructor barked after watching Marcus's clumsy attempts. "Are you trying to chop wood or fence? This is a blade, not an axe." The other candidates snickered, and Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks. He tried to adjust his stance, but his large frame felt awkward and ungainly compared to the fluid movements of his competitors. The marksmanship test was equally humiliating. Marcus had hunted rabbits with his father's old musket, but the pristine rifles used by the Royal Guard required a completely different approach. His shots went wide, missing targets that others hit with ease. The rangemaster shook his head disapprovingly and made notes on his clipboard that couldn't possibly be good. By the end of the first day, Marcus was exhausted and demoralized. He sat alone in the candidates' barracks, listening to the confident chatter of the others as they discussed the day's events. They seemed to find the test challenging but manageable, while he felt like he was drowning in unfamiliar water. "Not going well, is it?" a voice said beside him. Marcus looked up to see James Hartwell, the son of a decorated colonel. Unlike the others, James didn't seem to take pleasure in Marcus's struggles. "These tests, they're designed for people like us," James continued, gesturing toward the group of well-bred candidates. "People who've been preparing for this their whole lives." Marcus nodded glumly. "Maybe I should go home, save everyone the embarrassment." "Maybe," James agreed, then paused. "Or maybe there's something they're not testing for yet." The comment puzzled Marcus, but before he could ask what James meant, the lights-out call echoed through the barracks. As he lay on his narrow cot, Marcus stared at the ceiling and wondered if his mother's patches on his shirt would be the only thing he'd be remembered for at the Royal Military Academy. The next morning brought more tests and more failures. Marcus stumbled through tactical scenarios, fumbled military protocol, and completely botched an exercise in military law. With each passing hour, he fell further behind the other candidates. The instructor's expressions grew more dismissive, and he caught several of them exchanging glances that clearly said, "Why is this peasant boy still here?" But Marcus stayed. Something deep inside him, perhaps the same stubbornness that had kept his family's blacksmith shop running through lean times, refused to let him quit, even as the evidence mounted that he was completely out of his depth. Even as his scores remained at the bottom of every ranking, he continued to show up each morning, ready to fail again. What Marcus didn't know was that someone was watching. From his office window overlooking the training grounds, Field Marshal Wilhelm Harrison observed the daily activities with keen interest. The Field Marshal was a legend, a man who had risen from humble beginnings to become the most respected military leader in the kingdom. He had an eye for potential that others missed, and something about the young blacksmith's son had caught his attention. As Marcus prepared for another day of certain failure, unaware that his persistence had already begun to tell a different story than his test scores suggested, the real test of his character was only beginning. The third week of testing brought a new kind of humiliation for Marcus. The combat assessments had begun, and every morning started with hand-to-hand combat training. His opponent today was Richard Ashford, a lean young man whose father commanded an entire regiment. Richard moved like water, slipping away from Marcus's powerful but clumsy attacks and landing precise strikes that left bruises for days. "Thompson, you fight like a bear in a china shop," Sergeant Mills shouted from the sidelines. The other candidates laughed, but Marcus noticed that James Hartwell didn't join in. In fact, James seemed to be studying Marcus with genuine curiosity rather than amusement. After another embarrassing defeat, Marcus sat on the ground catching his breath while Richard helped him to his feet with surprising kindness. "You're stronger than any of us," Richard said quietly, "but strength without technique is just wasted energy." Marcus wiped blood from his split lip and nodded. He had heard variations of this comment from every instructor for weeks now. Strong but unrefined, determined but unskilled, honest but unfit for service. The words all meant the same thing. He didn't belong here. That afternoon brought the strategy examinations. Marcus stared at the elaborate map spread before him, trying to make sense of the symbols and terrain markers. The scenario involved defending a mountain pass against enemy forces, but the tactical options seemed endless and confusing. While other candidates moved pieces across the board with confidence, discussing flanking maneuvers and supply lines, Marcus felt lost in a maze of military terminology he barely understood. Captain Reynolds walked behind each candidate, observing their strategies and making notes. When he reached Marcus's table, he paused for a long moment, studying the simple and obviously incorrect troop positions Marcus had chosen. "Explain your reasoning, Thompson," the captain said, his voice neutral but firm. Marcus felt every eye in the room turn toward him. His face burned with embarrassment, but he forced himself to speak. I put most of the men at the narrowest part of the pass, sir. Seemed like the enemy would have to come through there eventually." "And your supply lines?" Marcus looked at the map again, realizing he had completely forgotten about supplies. I didn't really think about that part, sir." The silence in the room was deafening. A few candidates couldn't hide their smirks while others looked genuinely sorry for him. Captain Reynolds made another note and moved on without comment, but Marcus could practically hear the "fail" being written next to his name. The pattern continued day after day. Written examinations about military history and law left Marcus feeling like he was reading a foreign language. Etiquette lessons designed to prepare future royal guards for court functions were exercises in public humiliation. When the instructor demonstrated proper bowing techniques for greeting various levels of nobility, Marcus's attempts looked more like a farmer tipping his hat to the local magistrate. The royal guard must be prepared to move in the highest circles of society, the etiquette instructor, Master Pennington, explained with barely concealed disdain. They must understand protocol, precedence, and proper behavior in the presence of royalty. His eyes swept over Marcus dismissively. Some candidates clearly have more natural aptitude for this than others. But the worst came during the loyalty examination. Each candidate was called individually before a panel of senior officers and asked to discuss their understanding of duty, honor, and service to the crown. Marcus listened through the thin walls as other candidates delivered eloquent speeches about family military traditions, their deep understanding of political philosophy, and their sophisticated views on military ethics. When his turn came, Marcus stood before the three stern-faced colonels and tried to find words that wouldn't embarrass him further. Colonel Whitmore, the head of the panel, studied him with cold gray eyes. "Tell us, Thompson, why you wish to serve in the Royal Guard." Marcus's prepared speech, practiced for hours in front of a cracked mirror, evaporated from his mind. Instead, he found himself speaking from the heart. "My family needs the money, sir, and I think serving something bigger than myself might make me a better man than I am now." The honesty of the answer seemed to surprise the panel. Colonel Whitmore raised an eyebrow. "That's refreshingly direct, but the Royal Guard requires more than financial motivation. What can you offer that these other candidates cannot?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus thought of Richard's fluid combat style, James's tactical brilliance, and the natural leadership qualities he saw in so many of the other candidates. What could a blacksmith's son possibly offer that they couldn't provide in greater measure? "I don't know, sir," Marcus answered finally. "I'm not as smart as the others, and I don't have their training or education, but I've never quit anything in my life, even when I should have." Colonel Whitmore exchanged glances with his colleagues. "Persistence is admirable, Thompson, but the Royal Guard demands excellence, not merely determination." As Marcus left the examination room, he caught sight of Field Marshal Harrison at the end of the hallway. The legendary commander was speaking, quietly with Captain Reynolds, both men looking in Marcus's direction. Marcus quickly looked away and hurried back to the barracks, certain they were discussing his inevitable dismissal. That evening, the candidates gathered in the common room to compare notes on the day's examinations. Marcus sat in his usual corner, listening to the animated discussions about military strategy and court protocol. The gap between his knowledge and theirs seemed to grow wider each day. "You know," James Hartwell said, approaching Marcus with 2 cups of tea, "I've been thinking about what makes a good soldier." Marcus accepted the tea gratefully. "Probably everything I'm not good at." James shook his head. "I'm not so sure. My father always said that the best soldiers aren't necessarily the ones who look best on paper." He sat down beside Marcus. "Today, during the combat training, did you notice what happened when candidate Morrison got injured?" Marcus remembered. Morrison had twisted his ankle during a particularly intense sparring match and couldn't stand. While the instructors were busy setting up the next match, Marcus had simply walked over and helped Morrison to the medical tent, staying with him until the physician arrived. "Half the candidates didn't even notice," James continued. "The other half noticed but didn't want to interrupt their own training. But you just helped, without thinking about it." "Anyone would have done that," Marcus said, uncomfortable with the praise. "No," James replied seriously. "They really wouldn't have. And that might matter more than you think." As Marcus lay in his bunk that night, he thought about James's words. Tomorrow would bring more tests, more failures, and more evidence that he didn't belong among these future Royal Guards. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a small spark of something that might have been hope. Perhaps there were different ways to serve, different kinds of strength that couldn't be measured in test scores. Unknown to Marcus, Field Marshal Harrison was at that very moment reviewing the daily reports from all instructors. While Marcus's academic and technical scores remained at the bottom of every list, other notes had begun to appear in his file. Helped injured candidate without being asked. Always first to volunteer for unpleasant duties. Never complains despite obvious struggles. The Field Marshal read these comments with growing interest, remembering his own early days as a young soldier from humble beginnings. The fire started at 3 in the morning on a Tuesday. Marcus woke to the smell of smoke and the distant sound of shouting from the direction of the academy's east wing, while other candidates stirred sleepily in their bunks, asking what was happening. Marcus was already pulling on his clothes and heading for the door. The East Wing housed the Academy's library and administrative offices, but more importantly, it contained the quarters for the cleaning staff and kitchen workers, people Marcus had gotten to know during his weeks of struggling through the program. While other candidates barely noticed the servants who maintained their living quarters, Marcus had made a habit of helping with small tasks and learning their names. As he ran across the courtyard, Marcus could see flames licking at the second-story windows. A crowd of instructors and candidates had gathered at a safe distance, watching as the Academy's fire brigade worked to control the blaze. But Marcus noticed something the others had missed. Smoke was coming from the servant quarters, and he didn't see any of the staff among the crowd of onlookers. Without thinking, Marcus broke away from the group and headed toward the servant entrance. Behind him, he heard Captain Reynolds shouting, "Thompson, get back here, that area is off limits." But Marcus was already pushing through the side door into the smoke-filled corridor. The heat hit him like a physical blow and the smoke burned his eyes and throat. He pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth and began checking doors, calling out names he had learned over the past month. "Mrs. Henley, Tom, Sarah." His voice was muffled by the cloth, but he kept shouting as he moved through the narrow hallway. The smoke was getting thicker and he could hear the ominous creak of wooden beams stressed by the heat above. A weak voice called out from behind a door at the end of the hall. "Help, please." Marcus found Mrs. Henley, the elderly woman who managed the kitchen staff, trapped in her small room. A fallen beam had blocked her door and smoke was pouring in through cracks in the ceiling. She was conscious but barely able to stand. "I've got you," Marcus said, using his shoulder to force the door open wider. The beam was heavy, but years of blacksmith work had given him the strength to shift it just enough to create a gap. He lifted Mrs. Henley in his arms, surprised by how light she seemed despite her solid build. The return trip through the corridor was a nightmare of heat and smoke. Marcus could barely see a few feet ahead, and the building groaned around them as the fire spread. His lungs burned with each breath, and sweat poured down his face. Mrs. Henley had passed out, becoming dead weight in his arms, but he stumbled forward, following the wall with one hand while holding her with the other. When he finally burst through the servant entrance into the cool night air, Marcus collapsed to his knees, gasping and coughing. Mrs. Henley was unconscious but breathing. Captain Reynolds and several other instructors rushed over and someone shouted for the academy physician. "Thompson, you complete fool," Captain Reynolds barked. But there was something other than anger in his voice. "You could have been killed. What were you thinking?" Marcus couldn't answer immediately. His throat felt like sandpaper, and his eyes streamed from the smoke. When he finally found his voice, it came out as a rasp. "Someone had to check on the staff, sir. Nobody else seemed to notice they weren't accounted for." As the physician examined Mrs. Henley, confirming that she would recover fully, Marcus became aware that a crowd had gathered around them. All the candidates who had witnessed his rescue attempt were staring at him with expressions ranging from amazement to respect. Even Richard Ashford, who had easily defeated Marcus in every combat exercise, looked at him with something approaching awe. But it was the figure standing at the back of the crowd that surprised Marcus most. Field Marshal Harrison had apparently arrived on the scene and watched the entire rescue. The legendary commander's weathered face was unreadable, but his keen eyes were fixed on Marcus with unmistakable intensity. The next morning, word of the rescue had spread throughout the academy. As Marcus made his way to breakfast, nursing a persistent cough and sporting singed eyebrows, he found himself receiving nods and smiles from people who had barely acknowledged his existence before. The kitchen staff, in particular, seemed to view him as a hero. "You saved my grandmother's life," said Tom, a young man who helped in the kitchens. "She's all the family I have left." Marcus felt embarrassed by the attention. Anyone would have done the same thing, he said, the same response he always gave when people praised him for basic human decency. "No," Tom replied seriously. "They really wouldn't have. Most people don't even see us." The academic tests that day felt different somehow. Marcus still struggled with military history and tactical theory, but his fellow candidates treated him with a new kind of respect. James Hartwell went out of his way to help explain some of the more complex strategic concepts, and even Richard Ashford offered tips on sword techniques during combat practice. But the most significant change came from the instructors. While they still corrected his mistakes and graded his poor test performance, there was a new tone to their interactions. Sergeant Mills, who had been particularly harsh in his criticisms, pulled Marcus aside after combat training. "Your technique is still terrible, Thompson," the sergeant said bluntly. "You'll never be a skilled swordsman if you train for 100 years. Marcus's heart sank, but then the sergeant continued. "But last night showed something that can't be taught in any academy. You have instincts that matter more than perfect form." The comment puzzled Marcus. All his life he had been told that technique and training were what mattered. His father had constantly criticized his crude blacksmithing methods, comparing them unfavorably to the refined work of guild craftsmen. Yet here was a decorated military instructor suggesting that sometimes instinct trumped training. That afternoon brought news that would change everything. Captain Reynolds announced that the formal testing period was complete and results would be posted the following day. The candidates who passed would begin the final phase of Royal Guard training, while those who failed would be dismissed from the program. Marcus knew his fate was sealed. His test scores spoke for themselves. Dead last in academics, barely, passable in combat, and completely inadequate in areas like protocol and military law. The rescue of Mrs. Henley might have earned him some goodwill, but it couldn't overcome weeks of documented failure. That evening, he sat down to write a letter to his parents, preparing them for his return to Millbrook. He wanted to soften the blow of his failure, to help them understand that he had tried his best even though it wasn't good enough. "Dear Mother and Father," he began, "I will be coming home soon. The Royal Guard training is more difficult than I expected, and I'm afraid I'm not suited for this kind of service." As he struggled with the words, James Hartwell appeared at his elbow. "Writing home already? The results aren't even posted yet." Marcus looked up from his letter. "We both know how this ends. I appreciate your friendship, James, but I'm not fooling myself about my chances." James sat down across from him, his expression serious. "You know, my father once told me about a soldier in his regiment who couldn't shoot straight, couldn't march in formation, and barely understood basic military terminology." Marcus raised an eyebrow, wondering where this story was leading. But when their position was overrun by enemy forces, this same soldier held the line alone for 3 hours, giving the rest of the unit time to regroup and counterattack. "My father said that man saved more lives than all the academy graduates in his command combined." "What happened to him?" "He was promoted to sergeant and became one of my father's most trusted subordinates." James smiled. "Sometimes, Marcus, the most important qualities can't be measured by any test." As Marcus went to sleep that night, he tried not to hope. Hope had been a luxury he couldn't afford for weeks now. But somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, there were different kinds of tests than the ones he had been failing so consistently. The morning of results brought attention to the academy that Marcus could feel in every corner of the building. Candidates who had been confident for weeks now paced nervously, while those who knew they had struggled tried to maintain dignity in the face of certain disappointment. Marcus belonged firmly in the latter category, but he had made peace with his fate during a sleepless night. He dressed carefully in his cleanest shirt, the one his mother had patched with such hope just weeks ago. If this was to be his last official day at the Royal Military Academy, he would face it with whatever dignity he could manage. The other candidates in his dormitory were unusually quiet as they prepared for the announcement, each lost in private thoughts about their future. At precisely 9 o'clock, Captain Reynolds appeared in the main courtyard with a scroll bearing the Academy's official seal. The gathered candidates fell silent as he unrolled the document and cleared his throat. The morning air was crisp, and Marcus could see his breath as he waited for his name to be absent from the list of successful applicants. "The following candidates have successfully completed the initial phase of Royal Guard training and will advance to the final selection process," Captain Reynolds announced, his voice carrying clearly across the stone courtyard. The names began to flow in alphabetical order. Ashford Richard, no surprise there. Richard had excelled in every category. Hartwell, James. Again, completely expected. Marcus found himself genuinely pleased that his friend had succeeded, even as his own failure became more certain with each passing name. The list continued through names Marcus recognized, candidates who had demonstrated the academic excellence, physical prowess, and natural leadership that the Royal Guard demanded. As the captain moved through the alphabet, Marcus's stomach knotted tighter. When Reynolds reached the T-section without calling Thompson Marcus, the inevitable became official. Those candidates whose names were not called will report to the administrative office for discharge processing, Captain Reynolds concluded, rolling up the scroll. Dismissed. The courtyard erupted in celebration from successful candidates and quiet commiseration from those who had failed. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, feeling oddly empty rather than devastated. He had known this moment was coming, had prepared himself mentally, yet the finality still hit him like a physical blow. James Hartwell pushed through the crowd toward him, his face showing genuine distress despite his own success. "Marcus, I'm sorry. This doesn't make sense. After what you did with Mrs. Henley." "It's all right," Marcus replied, surprised to find that he meant it. "I gave it my best effort. Sometimes that's not enough." He shook James's hand firmly. "Congratulations. You'll make an excellent Royal Guard." Richard Ashford also approached, along with several other successful candidates. "Thompson, I want you to know that what you did during the fire, that took more courage than anything we've done in training." Marcus appreciated their kindness, but he was eager to complete the UN discharge process and begin the journey back to Millbrook. The longer he stayed, the more difficult it would become to maintain his composure. He had failed at the most important opportunity of his life, and his family would suffer the consequences of his inadequacy. As he walked toward the administrative building, Marcus passed the east wing where repairs were already underway from the fire damage. Mrs. Henley was supervising the cleaning of salvaged items, moving slowly but obviously recovered from her ordeal. When she saw Marcus, her weathered face broke into a warm smile. "Mr. Thompson, how can I ever thank you? The physician said another few minutes in that room would have—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she grasped his hands in hers. "You're a true hero, young man." "Just doing what anyone would do, ma'am," Marcus replied, the familiar response automatic now. "No," she said firmly, echoing what Tom had told him days earlier. "Anyone would not have done what you did. Most people would have stayed safe with the crowd." As Marcus continued toward his appointment with failure, he passed the Field Marshal's office. Through the tall windows he could see Field Marshal Harrison in deep conversation with several senior officers. Maps were spread across a large table, and the discussion appeared intense. Marcus wondered what strategic challenges occupied the mind of someone at that level, problems that made his own struggles seem small and insignificant. The discharge process was efficient and surprisingly dignified. The administrative clerk, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, processed Marcus's paperwork without commentary or judgment. "Transportation back to your home village has been arranged for this afternoon," the clerk explained. "The Academy provides travel funds and a letter of completion acknowledging your participation in the program." Marcus accepted the papers, noting the phrase "letter of completion" rather than "letter of failure." Someone had chosen those words carefully, and he appreciated the small kindness. The letter would at least show his family and neighbors that he had tried, that he hadn't simply given up when faced with a challenge. As he packed his few belongings in the dormitory, Marcus reflected on the past month. Despite his consistent failures, he had learned things about himself that might prove valuable in whatever future awaited him. He had discovered reserves of persistence he hadn't known he possessed, and he had made genuine friendships with young men from backgrounds completely different from his own. The afternoon sun was slanting through the dormitory windows when James appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath as if he had been running. "Marcus, you need to come with me now." "James, I appreciate the thought, but my transport leaves in an hour. I should finish packing." "No, you don't understand." James's eyes were bright with excitement and something else, urgency. "Captain Reynolds is looking for you. You need to report to the Field Marshal's office immediately." Marcus felt his stomach drop. Had he somehow violated protocol during the discharge process? Was he in trouble for the fire rescue despite the positive response it had received? The idea of facing additional humiliation before leaving the academy was almost unbearable. Did he say what it was about? Just that Field Marshal Harrison wants to see you personally. Marcus, when was the last time you heard of a failed candidate being summoned to the Field Marshal's office? The question sent a strange chill through Marcus. In all his weeks at the academy, he had never heard of such a thing. Failed candidates were processed quietly and sent home with minimal fuss. They certainly weren't granted audiences with the most powerful military leader in the kingdom. As they walked across the academy grounds toward the administrative complex, Marcus tried to imagine what Field Marshal Harrison could possibly want with him. Perhaps it was a formal reprimand for endangering himself during the fire. Maybe the Field Marshal wanted to deliver a personal lecture about knowing one's limitations and staying within appropriate bounds. Whatever the reason, Marcus realized that his time at the Royal Military Academy wasn't quite over yet. As they approached the imposing doors of the Field Marshal's office, he straightened his shoulders and prepared to face whatever final judgment awaited him. He had survived a month of constant failure and disappointment. He could certainly handle one more conversation, no matter how uncomfortable it might prove to be. James squeezed his shoulder as they reached the door. Whatever this is about, Marcus, remember what you've accomplished here. The test scores don't tell the whole story. Marcus nodded, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door that would determine whether his departure from the academy would be merely disappointing or absolutely catastrophic. The Field Marshal's office was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. Rich oak paneling covered the walls, decorated with battle standards from campaigns spanning decades. Behind an enormous desk sat Field Marshal Wilhelm Harrison, a man whose reputation had reached even the remote village of Millbrook. His gray hair was perfectly groomed, his uniform immaculate, but it was his eyes that commanded attention. Sharp, intelligent, and seeming to see right through anyone who stood before him. Thompson, the Field Marshal said without preamble, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. Sit. Marcus obeyed, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them on his knees. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, while Field Marshal Harrison studied a file that Marcus assumed contained his dismal test scores and failure records. Do you know why you're here, Thompson? No, sir. I assume it has something to do with my discharge from the program. The Field Marshal leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Your discharge? Yes, let's discuss that. He opened the file and began reading. Bottom 10% in academic examinations, failed tactical assessments, inadequate performance in combat evaluations, poor marks in protocol and etiquette. He looked up. By every measurable standard, you are completely unfit for service in the Royal Guard. Marcus felt his face burn with shame, but he forced himself to maintain eye contact. Yes, sir. I understand that. Do you? The Field Marshal stood and walked to the window overlooking the training grounds. Tell me about the night of the fire. The question surprised Marcus. Sir? The fire in the East Wing. Walk me through what happened from your perspective. Marcus described the events of that night, waking to the smell of smoke, noticing the absence of the staff from the crowd of onlookers, his decision to check the servant quarters despite orders to stay back. The Field Marshal listened without interruption, occasionally nodding but maintaining an unreadable expression. Why? The Field Marshal asked when Marcus finished. Why risk your life for a woman you barely knew? The question seemed strange to Marcus. Because she needed help, sir, and nobody else seemed to realize she was in danger. Captain Reynolds told you to stay back. You deliberately disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer. Marcus's stomach sank. This was it. He was being formally reprimanded for insubordination, in addition to his academic failures. Yes, sir, I did. Good, the Field Marshal said, surprising him completely. Following orders blindly without considering the human cost creates soldiers, but knowing when to disobey orders for the right reasons, that creates leaders. The comment left Marcus speechless. Field Marshal Harrison returned to his desk and pulled out another file, this one much thicker than the first. "Let me read you some other entries from your record, Thompson. Volunteered to assist in kitchen duties during his free time. Helped candidate Morrison to medical attention without being asked. Consistently shared his meal portions with candidates who finished theirs." The field marshal looked up. "Shall I continue?" Marcus didn't know how to respond. He had never considered these small actions worth recording. Every instructor, every staff member, every candidate who has interacted with you has noted the same thing. You notice people that others don't see. You help without being asked. You never complain despite facing challenges that would have driven most men to quit. The field marshal leaned forward. "Do you think these qualities are less important than the ability to recite military regulations?" I don't know, sir. I've always been taught that competence matters more than intentions." Field Marshal Harrison smiled, and for the first time, Marcus saw warmth in those sharp eyes. "Let me tell you about my own experience at this academy. Thompson. 40 years ago, I sat where you're sitting now. My test scores were abysmal. I couldn't remember the difference between a battalion and a brigade. I lost every sword fight, and I once accidentally addressed a visiting general as Your Majesty. The confession shocked Marcus. This legendary figure, whose military genius was studied throughout the kingdom, had struggled just as Marcus was struggling. My commanding officer at the time was ready to dismiss me. But one day, during a particularly brutal winter exercise, I found myself sharing my tent and rations with a young soldier who had lost his equipment in a river crossing. That soldier was suffering from exposure, and everyone else was too focused on their own survival to notice. I spent 3 days keeping him alive, missing training exercises, and falling further behind in my scores. The field marshal paused, lost in the memory. That soldier recovered and went on to become one of the finest officers I've ever served with. But more importantly, my actions were witnessed by Colonel Brennan, the Academy's most respected instructor. He saw something in me that the test scores couldn't measure. Marcus listened in stunned silence as the field marshal continued his story. Colonel Brennan became my mentor. He taught me that military excellence isn't just about following procedures or winning individual competitions. It's about understanding that every person under your command is someone's son, someone's father, someone's hope for the future. The greatest leaders are those who never forget that truth. The field marshal opened a drawer and pulled out an ornate document with the royal seal. The Royal Guard serves many functions, Thompson. We protect the royal family, certainly, but we also represent the highest ideals of military service. We are expected to be examples of honor, courage, and selfless dedication. Marcus stared at the document, not daring to hope he understood its significance. Your test scores are indeed terrible, the field marshal said with a slight smile. You would fail every written examination we could devise. But when a crisis arose, when lives were at stake, you acted with the kind of instinctive courage that cannot be taught in any classroom. You saw a need and filled it, regardless of personal cost or official protocols. The field marshal stood and walked around the desk to face Marcus directly. The Royal Guard needs officers who can think strategically and follow complex orders. But it also needs men who will never lose sight of their fundamental humanity. Men who will risk everything for a servant others don't even notice. Men who share their food with the hungry and help the wounded without being commanded to do so. Marcus felt his world tilting on its axis. Sir, I don't understand. Are you saying... I'm saying, Thompson, that there are different kinds of tests. The ones you failed measure technical competence. The ones you passed measure character. The field marshal handed him the ornate document. By my authority as Field Marshal of His Majesty's forces, I hereby commission you as a member of the Royal Guard with the rank of lieutenant. Marcus stared at the document, reading his own name written in elegant script below the royal seal. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the paper. But sir, the other candidates, my scores, the other successful candidates demonstrated the skills we can train and develop over time. You demonstrated the character traits that are either present from birth or never acquired at all. The field marshal returned to his chair. Your fellow graduates will learn tactics and protocol. You will learn alongside them. But you already possess the most important qualification for leadership. You genuinely care about the people you serve. The weight of the moment crashed over Marcus like a wave. After weeks of constant failure and mounting humiliation, he was not only being accepted into the Royal Guard but commissioned as an officer. The impossibility of it left him speechless. "There is one condition," the Field Marshal continued, his tone becoming more serious. "You will be assigned to my personal staff for the first year of your service. During that time, you will study military history, tactics, and administration under my direct supervision. Your education will be intensive and demanding." "Yes, sir. I understand, sir. I doubt you do, but you will." The Field Marshal's smile returned. "You will also continue to struggle with many aspects of traditional military service. But I believe you will bring something invaluable to the Royal Guard. A reminder that our ultimate purpose is to serve and protect people, not simply to execute orders efficiently." As Marcus prepared to leave the office, still clutching his commission in disbelief, the Field Marshal called out one final comment. "Thompson, your mother's patches on your shirt. They represent something far more valuable than a perfectly tailored uniform. They represent love, sacrifice, and the determination to make the best of limited resources. Don't ever be ashamed of where you came from." Walking across the academy courtyard toward the barracks where James was undoubtedly waiting anxiously, Marcus felt as though he was moving through a dream. The setting sun cast long shadows across the stone paths, and the familiar buildings looked different somehow, no longer intimidating, but welcoming. The most remarkable transformation, however, was in Marcus himself. For the first time since arriving at the academy, he walked with his shoulders straight and his head high, not because he had finally succeeded at the tests that had defeated him for weeks, but because he had discovered that the most important tests had been happening all along in moments when he thought no one was watching. The great hall of the royal palace had never seen anything quite like the ceremony that took place on a bright morning in late spring. Field Marshal Harrison had insisted on making Marcus's commissioning a public event, inviting not only the successful Royal Guard candidates and their families but also the academy staff, including Mrs. Henley and the other servants whose lives had been touched by Marcus's simple acts of kindness. Marcus stood at attention in his new uniform, still struggling to believe this was real. The dark blue coat with its silver trim fit perfectly, tailored specifically for his broad frame. On his chest, he wore the insignia of his rank and the distinctive golden cord that marked him as a member of the Field Marshal's personal staff. But most remarkable of all was the sight of his parents in the front row, his mother wearing her best dress and his father looking uncomfortable, but proud, in his only suit. The journey from failure to honor had been swift, but transformative. In the weeks following his unexpected commissioning, Marcus had thrown himself into his studies with a determination that surprised even Field Marshal Harrison. The same persistence that had kept him from quitting during his darkest moments at the academy now drove him to master subjects that had once seemed impossibly complex. His fellow Royal Guards, led by James Hartwell and Richard Ashford, had welcomed him with genuine warmth. The bonds forged during their shared struggles at the academy had created a brotherhood that transcended their different backgrounds. James, in particular, had become both friend and informal tutor, helping Marcus navigate the social complexities of court life with the same patience he showed when explaining military tactics. "Today," Field Marshal Harrison announced to the assembled crowd, "we commission new officers into the Royal Guard. These young men have demonstrated not only the technical competence required for their positions, but also the character necessary to serve with honor." As the Field Marshal spoke, Marcus caught sight of Mrs. Henley in the audience, her weathered face beaming with pride. Beside her sat Tom and several other academy staff members, people who had been invisible to most of the candidates, but who had found in Marcus someone who truly saw them as fellow human beings worthy of respect and consideration. "Lieutenant Thompson," the Field Marshal continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "step forward." Marcus moved to the center of the ceremonial platform, hyper-aware of every eye focused on him. The irony wasn't lost on him that just months ago, he had been the object of pity and barely concealed ridicule from many of these same people. "The Royal Guard exists to serve and protect," Field Marshal Harrison said, beginning the traditional commissioning oath. "But service and protection mean nothing without understanding what we truly defend, not just a crown or a palace, but the people of this kingdom, from the highest noble to the humblest servant." The words resonated deeply with Marcus. Throughout his intensive training period, the Field Marshal had consistently emphasized this philosophy. Military strategy and tactical excellence were important, but they were merely tools in service of a greater purpose, protecting those who could not protect themselves. "Do you, Marcus Thompson, swear to serve with honor, to lead with compassion, and to never forget that your greatest strength lies not in your sword arm, but in your willingness to sacrifice for others?" "I do so swear," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. The Field Marshal stepped forward and pinned a special commendation to Marcus's chest, a silver star that few royal guards ever received. "This recognition is not for academic excellence or tactical brilliance," he announced to the crowd. "It is for moral courage, for the ability to see beyond oneself, and for demonstrating that true leadership sometimes means disobeying orders in service of a higher principle." The audience erupted in applause, but Marcus barely heard it. His eyes were fixed on his parents, watching his mother wipe away tears, while his father struggled to maintain the stoic expression that years of hard labor had etched on his face. They had traveled for days to be here, leaving the blacksmith shop in the care of neighbors, all to witness their son's transformation from village failure to commissioned officer. After the ceremony, as guests mingled in the palace reception hall, Marcus found himself surrounded by well-wishers and curious nobles who had heard the story of the blacksmith's son, who couldn't pass a test but had earned the personal recognition of Field Marshal Harrison. The attention made him uncomfortable, but he answered their questions politely, always deflecting praise back to the people who had supported him. "Lieutenant Thompson," a voice said behind him. Marcus turned to find Colonel Whitmore, the stern officer who had questioned him during his disastrous loyalty examination weeks earlier. The colonel's expression was unreadable as he approached. "Sir," Marcus replied, bracing himself for what he assumed would be another reminder of his academic shortcomings. Instead, Colonel Whitmore extended his hand. "I owe you an apology, young man. During your examination, I failed to see what Field Marshal Harrison recognized immediately. I focused so intently on what you couldn't do that I missed the far more important question of who you are." The admission surprised Marcus. "Thank you, sir, but I understand your position. My performance was objectively poor. Performance can be improved with training and experience," the colonel replied. "Character cannot be taught. I've been in the military for 30 years, and I can count on one hand the number of officers I've met who possess your instinctive understanding of what service truly means." As the reception continued, Marcus made his way through the crowd, accepting congratulations, but always steering conversations toward his fellow graduates or the people who had helped him along the way. James approached with a glass of wine and a knowing smile. "Still uncomfortable with praise, I see," James observed. "It doesn't feel earned," Marcus admitted. "I failed every measure they used to evaluate us." "No," James corrected gently. "You failed every measure they thought they were using to evaluate us." But Field Marshal Harrison was administering a completely different test all along, one that most of us didn't even know we were taking. The truth of that statement struck Marcus forcefully. Looking back on his weeks at the academy, he could see now that every small act of kindness, every moment of helping others without expectation of reward, every instance of choosing compassion over self-interest had been noted and evaluated by someone who understood that character matters more than competence. Later that evening, after the formal celebrations had ended, Marcus found himself alone with Field Marshal Harrison in the same office where his life had been transformed weeks earlier. The Field Marshal poured 2 glasses of brandy and handed one to his newest officer. "To the future," the Field Marshal toasted, "and to the understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come from what the world considers failures." Marcus raised his glass, still marveling at the journey that had brought him to this moment. "Sir, may I ask you something?" "Of course." When did you first decide to recommend me for commissioning? Was it after the fire? Field Marshal Harrison smiled and shook his head. The fire confirmed what I already suspected, but it wasn't the deciding factor. Do you remember your first week at the academy, when you helped that injured candidate to the medical tent? Marcus nodded, remembering Morrison's twisted ankle. I was watching from my window. Every other candidate was focused on their own training, their own advancement. But you saw someone in need and simply helped, without calculation or expectation of reward. In that moment, I knew you possessed the rarest quality in military leadership, genuine concern for others. As Marcus prepared to leave the field marshal's office, beginning what he knew would be a challenging but rewarding career in service to the crown, he reflected on the unexpected path that had brought him here. He had come to the Royal Military Academy as a simple blacksmith's son seeking steady employment, and had discovered instead a calling that would define the rest of his life. The boy who couldn't pass a single test had become the man who passed the only test that truly mattered. The test of character, compassion, and unwavering commitment to serving others. And in passing that test, he had not only found his place in the world, but had reminded everyone around him that the greatest leaders are often those who never set out to lead at all, but simply chose to care when caring was needed most. Outside, the palace windows, the lights of the capital city twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing lives that might someday depend on the courage and compassion of people like Marcus Thompson. People who understood that true strength lies not in the ability to dominate others, but in the willingness to sacrifice for them.